Your destiny is reflecting in the polished chrome surfaces of the future, waiting for you to step up and claim it. Explore the powerful stories of those who took control of their fate. Click subscribe now and start building your own cinematic legacy starting right here.
I got walked out of my own company on a Wednesday morning at 9:14 a.m. I remember the exact time because I checked my watch when the new COO told security to escort me to the elevator. Not because I was angry, I checked it because I wanted to remember this moment for the rest of my life. 41 years old, wearing the same blue Oxford shirt I'd worn to my father's funeral 3 years earlier, carrying a cardboard box with a coffee mug, a framed photo of my son, and a stress ball shaped like a basketball that my assistant Lena had given me as a joke gift, and I walked out of the building my grandfather's name was on the lease of. Literally, the original 1987 lease still had his signature on a framed copy in the lobby, with a security guard named Derek holding the door open for me. Derek apologized. He whispered it. "Sorry, Mr. Ashby." That got me more than anything else that morning. Let me back up. My grandfather, Warren Ashby, started Ashby Logistics in 1971 out of a 2-truck operation in Columbus, Ohio. Freight forwarding, regional distribution, nothing glamorous. My father, Leonard Ashby, turned it into a genuine mid-size operation. 11 warehouses, contracts with 3 major retailers, about 340 employees at peak. When my father died of a heart attack in the spring of 2022, he left the company in a trust structure that his attorney had helped him build over the previous decade. The trust owns 78% of the voting shares. I was the sole trustee and beneficiary. My father also left behind a board of 4 outside directors, a CFO he'd hired 2 years before he died, and a standing instruction in his estate documents that I have always found equal parts touching and insulting. It said, roughly, "My son is brilliant, but he needs time. Don't let him run it alone until he's ready." I was 38 when he died. I had an MBA from Ohio State and had spent 6 years working in operations at a regional freight company in Cincinnati before coming back to help my father. I was, by any reasonable measure, ready. But my father knew me. He knew I had a tendency to move fast and assume everyone else could keep up, so he left instructions. The board took those instructions seriously. They hired a chief operating officer named Blaine Rutherford, came from a consulting background, Stanford MBA, very polished, the kind of guy who said going forward and at the end of the day in the same sentence without apparent discomfort. He was brought in with a mandate to modernize operations and professionalize the management structure. My role was officially listed as Director of Strategic Partnerships, which sounded important and meant almost nothing. I want to be honest here. I didn't fight it. My father had asked me not to. And there was a part of me, a real part, that wondered if maybe the board was right. I had just lost my dad. I wasn't sleeping well. My marriage had ended the year before and my son was 7 and living primarily with his mother in Cincinnati. I was not at my best, so I let Blaine take the wheel and I watched. What I saw in the first 4 months was mostly fine. Blaine was organized. He brought in new software for route optimization. He renegotiated 2 supplier contracts and saved real money. The board loved him. I was cautiously optimistic. Then the summer came. The first thing Blaine did that bothered me was restructure the regional manager layer. We had 7 regional managers, all of them long tenured, all of them deeply embedded in their territories. These were people who knew the truck drivers by name, who could call a dock supervisor at 11 p.m. when a shipment was stuck and get it moving because they had personal relationships built over years. Blaine called them redundant. He said the new software made that layer of management unnecessary. He laid off 4 of them in one afternoon in June. I heard about it from my father's old assistant, a woman named Gloria who had been with the company since 1998 and who texted me a string of emojis I had to ask my son to translate. The short version was, she was devastated, and she thought I needed to know. I called Blaine that evening. He was patient and slightly condescending, the way very smart people sometimes are with other very smart people they've decided are below them. He explained his reasoning. I pushed back. He said, "I appreciate your perspective," which is the professional equivalent of hanging up the phone on someone while maintaining eye contact. I brought it to the board. They sided with Blaine. The data supported his decision, they said. The new systems would compensate. I left that meeting feeling something I hadn't expected to feel in my own company. Powerless. What I did next was probably not what a more strategic person would have done immediately. I hired an attorney. Not to fight the board. Not yet. I hired her, a woman named Constance, corporate law specialist, 20 years of trust and estate litigation, to spend 2 weeks doing nothing but reviewing my father's trust documents, the shareholder agreement, and the company bylaws. Every word, every clause, every footnote. What she found took her 11 days and 3 phone calls to explain fully. The short version, the trust structure my father and his attorney had built contained a provision that had never been tested, never been publicly discussed, and that nobody on the board appeared to have read carefully. It was in Section 9, subsection C of the trust instrument itself. It stated that in the event the trustee determined, in his sole discretion, that the company's management was taking actions materially harmful to the long-term interests of the trust beneficiaries, the trustee could invoke direct operational control without a board vote, effective upon written notice to the registered agent and each board member. Sole discretion, no vote required. Direct operational control. My father had built a kill switch, and he had given it to me. Constance explained it carefully, almost reverently. "This is unusual," she said. "Your father's attorney was either very creative or very prescient, possibly both. You have the ability to essentially override the board and assume direct control of the company's operations with a letter." I sat with that for a long time, and I made a decision that I still believe was right, even though it cost me more than I expected. I decided not to use it yet. Here is why. And I want to be clear about this because the criticism I later received, and there was real, fair criticism, deserves a direct answer. My father built this company over 30 years. The people in it, the culture, the relationships with clients and carriers and warehouse staff, that wasn't something that could survive a war between the owner and the board. If I invoked that clause in the summer, with the board freshly united behind Blaine and my own credibility with the staff uncertain, I risked turning a management problem into a company-wide crisis. People would leave. Clients would get nervous. The lenders who held the lines of credit would call for reassurance. My grandfather's name was on the lease, but it was also on our reputation, and I was not willing to put that reputation through a civil war unless I had no other choice. I also, and this is harder to admit, I wanted Blaine to be wrong on his own terms. I wanted the data to show what I knew in my gut, that you cannot run a relationship-based logistics business like a software company. You cannot replace a regional manager who has been buying the same dock supervisor lunch every month for 8 years with an algorithm. I wanted that to be demonstrably, undeniably clear before I moved. So I watched. I documented everything. I kept a private file with dates, decisions, and outcomes. I talked to Gloria and to the other employees who still called me because they'd known my father. I stayed in my meaningless Director of Strategic Partnerships role and went to meetings and said very little and took very careful notes. The fall was bad. 2 of the 3 major retail contracts flagged service issues. On-time delivery dropped 4 percentage points in Q3, which doesn't sound like much until you understand that our contracts had penalty clauses at the 3-point threshold. We paid out in penalties what the laid-off regional managers had collectively cost us in salary. Blaine's response was to add more software, another optimization layer, a dashboard that the remaining managers found confusing, and that required 3 training sessions to operate at a basic level. Gloria told me that one of the warehouse supervisors in the Dayton facility had started a private group chat called "Remember When We Knew What We Were Doing?" She sent me a screenshot. I did not laugh. In November, Blaine proposed eliminating the company's safety committee, a standing committee that my grandfather had established after a truck accident in 1983 that had injured 2 drivers. It had no regulatory requirement behind it. It was just something my family had maintained because it was the right thing to do, because it meant drivers felt heard, because it had caught 2 near misses in the past decade that could have been serious. Blaine called it redundant. Administrative overhead. The board approved it with 3 votes to 1. The one dissenter being the oldest board member, a man in his 70s who had known my grandfather personally and who called me that night sounding genuinely shaken. That was November 14th. I remember the date. I called Constance the next morning and told her to prepare the notice. I want to be direct here. I did not wait until Blaine fired me. I made the decision to invoke the clause before he ever called me into that conference room. The firing accelerated my timeline by about 3 weeks, but I had already decided. What happened was this. In early December, Blaine conducted a review of what he called redundant senior-level roles, my position. Director of Strategic Partnerships was identified as one of them. I received a calendar invite for a one-on-one on a Wednesday morning at 9 a.m. No agenda, just one-on-one with Blaine. I knew what it was before I walked in. He was sitting at the head of the conference room table with our HR director, a man named Philip who looked like he would genuinely rather be anywhere else on the planet. There was a folder on the table. Blaine didn't stand up when I came in. "I'll get right to it," he said. "We're eliminating your role effective today. Your position as Director of Strategic Partnerships no longer aligns with our operational priorities going forward." He pushed the folder across the table. "We've prepared a severance package that we think is very fair given the circumstances." I looked at the folder. I looked at Philip. I looked back at Blaine. "Okay," I said. He seemed faintly surprised that I didn't argue. I think he'd been prepared for a fight. He'd probably rehearsed a speech about how this wasn't personal, about how the decision was made for business reasons, about how he'd be happy to serve as a reference. I picked up the folder and I said, "I'll have my attorney review this." He nodded like that was perfectly normal, which of course it was, and then I walked out, and Derek, the security guard, held the door, and I sat in my car in the parking garage for about 15 minutes. I wasn't crying. I was doing math. I was thinking about timing. I was thinking about the sequence of events that needed to happen next, and whether Constance could get everything filed before the end of the business day. She could. By 4:30 p.m. that Wednesday, the registered agent of Ashby Logistics, Inc. had received a formal written notice invoking Section 9C of the Ashby Family Trust, executed by Warren Leonard Ashby II, sole trustee, asserting direct operational control of the company effective upon delivery. Each board member received a certified copy. The company's corporate counsel, who had, to his credit, actually read Section 9C, called the board chair at approximately 4:05 p.m. I am told the board chair said a word that is not appropriate to repeat. Constance had also, with my instructions, drafted a separate letter to Blaine Rutherford informing him that his employment contract was being terminated for cause, specifically for a pattern of management decisions materially harmful to the trust beneficiaries, documented in an attached exhibit that ran 17 pages. 17 pages. I had been taking notes for 5 months. I did not call Blaine personally. I thought about it and decided against it. There was nothing either of us needed to say. The board meeting was the following Monday. I called it. It was the first board meeting I had ever chaired, and I want to tell you that I was nervous in a way I had not been nervous since the first time I presented to my father's board of directors as a 29-year-old trying to justify a capital expenditure. I sat at the head of the table that my grandfather had bought at an office liquidation sale in 1979. It was an ugly table. Dark veneer over particle board, held together with wood glue and stubbornness, and my father had refused every attempt to replace it. And I looked at 4 board members who ranged in expression from wary to hostile to resigned. The oldest board member, the one who had called me after the safety committee vote, gave me a small nod when I sat down. That helped. I kept the meeting short. I had learned from watching Blaine that long presentations are often a way of avoiding accountability. I presented 3 things: the Q3 and Q4 performance data, the client feedback I had gathered directly from 2 of our 3 major retail partners over the previous 6 weeks, and a 12-month operational plan. The operational plan included reinstating the regional manager layer, not all 4 who had been laid off because 2 had already taken other positions, and I wasn't going to ask them to upend their lives again, but 2 new ones, hired from within, promoted from the field. It included restoring the safety committee. It included a frank conversation with our lenders about the Q3 penalties and a concrete plan to rebuild the on-time delivery numbers by the following summer. One board member asked me directly, "Why didn't you invoke the clause sooner? Before the Q3 decline? Before the layoffs?" I had thought about how to answer this question. I gave him the honest answer. "Because I needed to be certain," I said. Not certain that Blaine was wrong. I was certain about that earlier than I should admit. I needed to be certain that the company could survive what came next. Invoking that clause was going to create disruption. I wanted to minimize it. In hindsight, I waited too long, and 4 people lost jobs they shouldn't have lost, and I'm going to have to live with that. Nobody argued with that answer. I think they respected it, or at least respected that I didn't try to spin it. The board ratified my control transition without a formal vote. Constance had advised me that the clause didn't require one, but I wanted the ratification anyway because I was going to need these 4 people to function as an actual board going forward, not as adversaries. They gave it. I walked out of that meeting as the operating head of my family's company. The same company I'd been walked out of with a cardboard box 6 days earlier. The first thing I did when I got back to my office, my father's old office, which Blaine had redecorated and which still smelt faintly of new paint, was call Gloria. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd been waiting. I told her what had happened. There was a pause, and then she made a sound that I can only describe as decades of loyalty being vindicated all at once, and then she said very quietly, "Your father would be so proud of you." I held it together until after I hung up. The recovery took the better part of 18 months. I won't pretend it was clean or simple or that I got everything right. We lost one of the 3 retail contracts anyway. They had already made the decision to consolidate with a larger national carrier, and even our improved performance numbers weren't enough to reverse it. That hurt. But the other 2 held, and we rebuilt the Dayton and Columbus operations with people who knew what they were doing. And by the following spring, our on-time numbers were back above where they'd been when my father was alive. The safety committee met again for the first time on a Thursday morning in January. There were 12 people around the table, including 3 truck drivers and a dock supervisor who had driven 40 minutes each way to be there. I sat in the back and didn't say anything. It wasn't my meeting. It was theirs. My son came to the Columbus office for the first time that summer. He was 8 by then, and mostly he wanted to know if he could press buttons in the freight elevator. I let him press all of them. We rode up and down for about 20 minutes. And he asked me whose name was on the sign outside, and I told him it was his great-great-grandfather's name. "Is that us?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "That's us." He thought about that for a second the way 8-year-olds think about things, very seriously and then completely done with it. "Cool," he said, and pressed the button for the 3rd floor again. My father was right that I needed time. He was also right that I needed time. He was also right that I'd know when I was ready. I just wish he were here so I could tell him that both things were true at once, that I needed the time and that I was ready, and that holding both of those realities together without breaking was maybe the hardest thing I've ever done. But we're still here. The name's still on the lease, and I intend to keep it that way. People ask me sometimes what the lesson is. Like there has to be a clean one. Like I went through 18 months of watching my father's company get picked apart and came out the other side with a quote you could put on a coffee mug. I don't have that. What I have is this. Blaine was not a villain. I want to say that clearly because it would be easier if he were. He was a smart, confident man who had been given a job and did it the way he knew how. He believed in the data. He believed that systems could replace relationships. He believed that efficiency was the same thing as health. He was wrong, but being wrong is not the same as being evil. And I think one of the things I had to grow into, one of the things this entire period forced me to grow into, was the ability to hold those 2 truths at the same time. He caused real harm, and he was not a monster. Both. What I keep coming back to is the safety committee. My grandfather started it after 2 drivers were hurt in 1983. There was no law requiring it, no regulator watching. He did it because he decided that the people who drove the trucks deserved the seat at the table when it came to their own safety. That committee met for 40 years without ever making headlines. It just quietly did its job. And the moment someone looked at it through a spreadsheet, it became overhead. It became redundant. It became a line item to cut. That's what happens when intelligence operates without ethics. Not malice, just absence. The absence of asking, what is this actually for? Who does this serve? What would we lose if it were gone? Blaine never asked those questions because his framework didn't require them. And that's the thing about intelligence without a moral anchor. It's not dangerous because it's stupid. It's dangerous because it's competent. It executes very efficiently in the wrong direction. My father understood something I'm still learning. He knew that I had the mind for this work. He was less certain I had the patience. And patience is not passivity. I want to be clear about that, because I got criticized for waiting, and some of that criticism was fair. Patience is knowing the difference between the moment that requires action and the moment that requires documentation. It's building your case before you make your move, not because you're cowardly, but because you respect the stakes enough to do it right. I waited too long on one thing: the regional managers. Those 4 people lost jobs they'd earned over years, and my caution cost them that. I'll carry that, but I also know that if I had invoked that clause in a panic in June, before Constance had finished her review, before I understood the full legal structure, before I had the performance data in hand, I might have won the battle and lost the company. Restraint and recklessness can look identical from the outside. The difference is what's happening on the inside. Gloria still works at Ashby Logistics. She will probably retire there. On the day I called to tell her what had happened, she said my father would be proud of me. I held it together until after I hung up, and then I didn't. That's the thing about resilience. It doesn't mean you don't feel it. It means you feel it and you keep going anyway. My grandfather built something from 2 trucks and stubbornness. My father grew it and protected it and then handed me a kill switch and trusted me to know when to use it. And I sat in the parking garage for 15 minutes after being walked out of my own building, doing math and thinking about timing, and then I called my attorney. That's all it was. You feel it, then you do the next thing.